I used to think Yellowstone had no secrets left for me. After 10 years of walking its trails, I knew its rhythms, its sounds, the subtle way pine needles hush the ground when a deer passes, the difference between a cougar's cry and the shuffle of a bear nosing through brush. The park had become less a workplace than an extension of my body. But the summer of 1996 showed me just how little I truly understood about this land. It began with voices over the ranger radio. Tourists camped at the south shore of Shoshone Lake. They said they had been woken by screams in the night. They tried to describe them, but the words fell short. It wasn't a human scream, and it wasn't the cry of an animal. It was something stretched between the two, long and raw enough to strip the warmth from their blood. At dawn, they'd packed up their tents and fled without breakfast. Without even glancing back, we logged it as a mountain lion. That's what we tell people when the sounds don't fit. Lions can scream like a woman in pain. It was a neat explanation, a box to close the matter. But the following week, another call came. A family had returned from a hike to find their campsite ripped apart. Not just rummaged through, but shattered. Their bear-proof cooler, a tank of heavy steel, had been torn like paper. Their tent was shredded. The cast iron grill by their fire pit was hurled into the trees as though flung by some unseen hand. Yet what unsettled me most wasn't what was destroyed, but what was untouched. The food remained, scattered but uneaten, as though the act had never been about hunger. I walked the perimeter with Jim, the best tracker I ever knew. He scoured the stony ground, but there were no bear prints. No clean pads or claws to follow, just impressions dense in the earth, as though something too heavy for our imagination had brushed through. We filed the report under atypical bear behavior. That phrase became our shield. The higher-ups wanted the tourists calmed, the papers clear of anything frightening. But as I read the words aloud to myself, I felt like I was forging a lie. I volunteered to patrol the area alone. I thought the silence of solitude might tell me something the paperwork couldn't. The first day was ordinary. Jays bickered in the branches. The air smelled of sun-baked sap. By evening, I made camp near a stream, a small fire to keep the dark at bay. The night passed without incident. But at dawn, as I trekked through the pines, something changed. The forest went mute. Birds abandoned their songs mid-note, squirrels froze in their branches. Even the insects seemed to vanish. The absence pressed in on me like a weight on my chest. I tightened my grip on my rifle. That's when the smell reached me. Musk and wet hide, yes, but underneath, something sharper, metallic, sour like rust and water. It stuck in my throat, made me swallow again and again, as if the air itself had turned toxic. I followed it until I reached a clearing, a flat bed of grass laced with sunlight. That's where I saw them. Footprints. I froze, unable to blink, unable even to breathe. They were not bear prints. They were not human. Each was longer than my forearm, the heel broad, the arch defined like a man's, yet twice the size and pressed so deep into the soil, it looked as though the ground itself had flinched from their weight. I knelt, my knees shaking, and traced one with my eyes. The stride was impossibly long, a path of steps that stretched in a rhythm no animal I knew could match. I took out my camera, hands trembling, and snapped pictures until the film word empty. For the first time in years, I felt truly afraid. Not of claws or teeth, but of something I couldn't classify. Something that belonged nowhere in the books or the training manuals. I forced myself back to the station before nightfall, the film pressed tight in my pocket like a hidden wound. I showed the photographs to Dale Hargrove, my supervisor. He studied them silently, his jaw working but his eyes blank, as though he was staring into a well too deep to measure. When he finally looked up, there was no skepticism, no dismissal, only fatigue and, beneath it, something that looked like dread. "What do you think it is, Arthur?" he asked. I shook my head. The words wouldn't come. He didn't push me. Instead, he said, "We'll call it a bear, but we'll catch it. Whatever it is, we'll catch it." That night, while I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, I kept seeing those prints. Not as impressions in the soil, but as openings, as if something had stepped not just across the earth, but through a curtain into our world. The next morning, Dale gathered us in the briefing room. He spread a map of Shoshone Lake across the table, the red circle drawn around my clearing like a wound on the land. The official order was clear: trap and relocate a dangerous grizzly. He repeated it until the words lost meaning, until they were little more than camouflage draped over our silence. We all knew the truth, though no one dared give it a name. That evening, we loaded the cage onto the truck. It was built to move rhinoceroses, a beast of steel bars and reinforced locks. Watching it clank into place made me feel less like a ranger and more like a soldier marching into a war no one had declared. We drove toward the lake as the sun sank, the trees bleeding orange at their edges. The cab smelled of oil and sweat, but underneath, something else, a waiting tension that filled every breath. No one spoke. Even Jim's knuckles, locked around the wheel, seemed to glow white. By the time we reached the clearing, the forest had swallowed the last light. We worked in silence, masking the cage with branches, lashing the deer carcass to the trigger wire. The metal groaned and clattered, jarring against the stillness. Each sound seemed to bruise the night. When all was ready, we retreated to a rock outcrop 100 yards away, the cage's dark mouth just visible between the trees. We spread our gear, night vision scopes casting the world in shades of sickly green. And then we waited. Hours slid by, marked only by the ache in my legs and the slow creep of cold up through the earth. Coyotes howled in the distance, a brief reminder of the ordinary. But beneath their cries, I heard something else, a vibration, low and faint, as though the ground itself had pulsed, missing a heartbeat. At 2 a.m, a shape emerged from the tree line. It did not crawl, it did not lumber. It walked, upright, fluid, massive. Its outline through the scope filled my vision, shoulders wide as the cage itself, arms swinging low, hair like ink spilling down its frame. I gripped my rifle so tightly my fingers ached. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, unmoving, as if listening. In the glow of my scope, its silhouette was a wall of blackness. My breath snagged. It turned its head, slow, deliberate, like a man studying the night for threats. It stepped forward, and the forest held still, as though even the wind had withdrawn to watch. I didn't tell anyone about the ring of stones. Not Dale, not Jim, not Bill. The words sat heavy on my tongue and refused to leave. Maybe it was fear of sounding unstable. maybe it was something closer to shame, because in that circle, under the stare of hollowed-out skulls, I'd felt not just dread but recognition, like I had walked in on a conversation where I was the subject. That night, when the rest of the station lay quiet, I pulled the blinds in my quarters and spread out the photos I had taken of the prints in the clearing. I compared them to the neat diagrams in our wildlife manuals, aligning them against bear pads, wolf paws, cougar tracks. They didn't match, not even close. What I had photographed was something else, something that shouldn't exist yet left its weight written into the dirt as clear as scripture. Sleep never found me. I lay awake with the image of those eyes that didn't plead for release, didn't rage against captivity, but instead looked at me like a craftsman studies raw timber, deciding where to cut first. When dawn cracked, I walked out into the yard and felt the whole park shift beneath the normal day. Tourists milled with maps in hand. Cars idled at the entrance gate. Elk moved slow and docile across the meadows. Yellowstone performed its ordinary play, but I knew what had slipped through the curtains backstage. 2 days later, reports started trickling in. Hikers whispering about strange echoes near Shoshone, sounds not carried by throat or wind. A group claimed they'd seen flashes above the tree-line, no fire, no storm, just pale lights blinking like signals in a code too fast to follow. Another ranger, not part of our original team, filed a note about a guttural humming that shook the leaves around his truck, though no engine ran nearby. He laughed it off in the report, but the handwriting betrayed him tight. Cramped, the scroll of someone forcing calm. One evening, Jim cornered me in the gear shed. His face was gray, his eyes rimmed raw. He leaned close and whispered, "Arthur, it wasn't alone." I waited, the silence between us clanging louder than the steel hooks on the wall. He told me he had gone back to the clearing against orders, just to stand there, just to convince himself it was real. And what he found were tracks, more than one line of them. 2, maybe 3, some smaller, some wider. They wove into each other, overlapping like the rhythm of a hunt. He didn't photograph them. He said he couldn't bear to have them developed, to watch them stare back at him from paper. The dread became communal without anyone naming it. We moved differently on patrol, quieter, rifles slung tighter, eyes fixed not on bears but on spaces between the trees. A silence settled over the station in the evenings. Conversations clipped down to a sentence or two before dying. Bill started drinking, though he'd never touched more than a beer in all the years I'd known him. He said it helped him sleep. It didn't. I could hear him pacing the barracks hall at 3 in the morning, boots dragging like he couldn't remember how to walk. A week later, I was assigned a solo loop around the northern ridge. It was routine on paper, but nothing felt routine anymore. The day was cleared, the lake a sheet of glass under the sky. Yet as I walked deeper into the pines, the air thickened, resin and loam heavy in my lungs. The forest dimmed faster than it should have, as if the light above the canopy had grown reluctant to filter through. That was when I heard it, not the roar from the cage, not the scream that had sent tourists running, but a low vibration, steady, metallic, like the bow of a ship dragging across the ocean floor. It pressed against my ribs, a hum I couldn't place outside of machines. Yet no machines lived here. I froze. The sound grew until the needles on the branches around me trembled. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it cut out, leaving the woods too quiet, as if the trees themselves were listening for its return. And then I saw them. Not shapes, not faces, but eyes. Dozens of them, low in the undergrowth, catching the last scrap of light. They did not blink. They did not scatter like deer. They simply watched. Some were small green glints, some higher, broader, reflecting pale like frozen moons. My breath rattled loud enough to betray me, and in that instant they disappeared. Not running, not breaking twigs, just gone, as though they had never been there at all. I staggered back to camp without finishing the patrol. My report was bare, unusual silence. Nothing sighted, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. That night, lying awake, I thought of the cage being winched onto that black truck. I thought of the men who had taken it away, how polished they were, how rehearsed. If they'd done it once, they'd done it before, which meant the thing we caught at Shoshone wasn't the only one. And worse, it wasn't the first. The days blurred after that. Sleep became shallow. Every dream a replay of that steel door crashing down, of those eyes meeting mine through the bars. When tourists smiled at me on the trail, their faces looked wrong, stretched over something else. Dale stopped calling briefings. He spent hours in his office with the blinds drawn, the kind of man who used to carry the weight of the park like a badge, now hunched under a silence that made him unrecognizable. One night, long after lights out, I heard the station radio hiss, alive. Not chatter, not a call, just static. I rose barefoot and crossed the hall. The unit on Dale's desk glowed green in the dark, volume turned low. Beneath the hiss came a pattern, 3 long bursts. A pause too short, repeating. A signal, not ours. Not on any frequency I knew. Dale sat in the shadows, headset on, scribbling into a notebook I couldn't see. He looked up once, and in that moment his face was hollowed out, like someone staring not at the page, but at something beyond the wall, beyond the park. He didn't acknowledge me. He just kept writing, the static spilling on, the pattern looping. I backed out before he could speak. That night the dream returned, sharper than before. The cage, the eyes, and then another pair behind them, deeper in the dark, watching the first the way the first had watched me. And I woke with the sense that what we had trapped at, Shoshone Lake, wasn't the predator at all. It was the bait. I couldn't keep the dream from bleeding into waking hours. The thought gnawed at me during patrols, when the trails wound through stands of lodgepole, pine and the sunlight fractured into shards on the ground. That thing we'd caged, massive, brutal, ancient, it hadn't been the hunter. It had been what the real hunters wanted caught. I tried to dismiss it, told myself it was fatigue, the echo of adrenaline, but the idea rooted itself like a nail driven into wood. A few nights later, the radio hissed again, the same rhythm pulsing through the static. 3 long bursts, too short, over and over, like a beacon for ears not human. Dale didn't hide it this time. He called me into his office and pushed the notebook toward me. Pages of frantic scrawl, coordinates, dates, symbols that didn't belong to any ranger's manual. He said nothing, just looked at me with eyes hollowed out by whatever he had been hearing. When I asked who was sending the signal, he didn't answer. His lips parted as if to form words, then pressed shut, like the sound itself had warned him against speaking. 2 mornings later, hikers reported another circle. Stones, smaller this time, arranged on a slope where no human trail cut through. At the center was a log, split open clean, not by axe or saw, but sheared as though something had twisted it bare-handed. I rode out with Jim to investigate. He walked stiff, silent, his hands twitching toward the rifle slung across his back. When we found the circle, we stopped yards short. The bones inside this one weren't animal remains. They were birds, lined with precision, each skull set facing east. The smell of resin and something sharper clung in the air, sharp enough to make my nose burn. Jim bent down, touched one of the stones. He flinched, cursed under his breath, said it was hot even in the cool mountain shade. I leaned closer but didn't touch it. I swear the ground beneath those stones throbbed, subtle as a vein. I wanted to photograph it, document it, but for the first time in my career, I couldn't raise the camera. Something about pointing glass and lens at that circle felt like an invitation, like raising a mirror to something that preferred to remain unseen. That night, the silence broke. It was near 2 in the morning when a sound lifted through the trees. Outside the station, a chorus, long and rolling, not the voice of one throat but many, weaving into each other like cords of rope. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't human. It was something that dragged the marrow of my bones into its rhythm. I jolted upright, heart smashing against ribs, and saw Jim standing in the hallway, his eyes wide and wet. "They're calling it back," he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. We didn't sleep after that. None of us. Dale started locking his office, even during daylight. A man who used to leave everything open, like air. Bill packed his bags one morning, said he couldn't take it anymore. He left without telling anyone where he was going. We never heard from him again. 3 days later, black SUVs returned. Same convoy, same silence, same men whose boots didn't crunch on gravel. They didn't bother with the cover story this time. They marched straight into Dale's office. I stood outside, listening to muffled words, low and clipped. When the door opened, Dale looked 10 years older. The man in the suit brushed past me without a glance, but as he did, I caught a word murmured low enough it might not have been meant for me at all. Containment failed. That night I left the station alone. I followed the trail down to Shoshone's edge, the lake flat and black under a thin moon. I don't know why I went. Maybe I wanted proof beyond cages and files. Maybe I wanted to see if I was already too deep in the lie to crawl back. The forest was still, but not dead. It was waiting. I felt it in the pines, in the hush of water against stone. And then I saw them. Across the far bank at the tree line, figures stood, tall, broad, their outlines shifting in the thin mist. Not one, not 2 more than I could count before my vision blurred. Their eyes reflected faint silver, a constellation broken loose from the sky. They didn't move toward me. They didn't need to. The message was already written in the way they stood, the way the lake stretched between us like a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I stood there until the moon drowned itself behind clouds. When I finally turned back toward camp, I knew with a certainty that chilled me, deeper than the mountain air, The thing we'd trapped had never been alone. The cage had only proved what else was out there, and now the balance had shifted. We had taken something from them, and they were waiting for its return. I don't patrol anymore. I don't wear the uniform. I live with the knowledge pressed against my ribs, heavier than the rifle I used to carry. Sometimes in the dead hours before dawn, I hear the hum again, faint and metallic, threading through the walls like a warning. And I remember the eyes across the lake, the way they didn't blink, the way they didn't need to move closer to own the night. And I know the story isn't over, because out there, beyond the reach of lanterns and campfires, something older than memory is still watching, and it hasn't forgotten who shut the door of the cage.